Okay. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to this session, in which we're going to discuss many of the ideas within this new book by Simon Birnbaum, Basic Income Reconsidered, Social Justice, Liberalism, and the Demands of Equality. The reason why we organized this panel has to do with the quality of this book. We thought, many of us thought that it would be worth discussing it. In fact, some of those who are talking about the need of having a deep discussion on this book is not here. He couldn't make it to Munich. He's Jürgen de Wispeler. But Jürgen wrote an endorsement of this book, which has been printed into the back of it. So let me just read this as a sort of an introduction. Jürgen says, at a time when economic insecurity and inequality have reached unprecedented levels, Birnbaum constructs a highly innovative, radically liberal justification for unconditional basic income that pays as much attention to philosophical foundations as to considerations of feasibility and political reality. Basic Income Reconsidered offers its readers a careful, argued, and intuitively appealing vision of why basic income is a must, and navigates the many objections to this proposal in a way that will shape the debate for years to come. Well, since many of us think that this is the case, we realized that it would be interesting to have a discussion on that. By the way, there are a few copies left of this book downstairs, but there are forms that you can fill and send to Palgrave, and then you will get the book in at a lower price. Simon knows very much the literature, very well, but there are several authors that have been especially influential in his thought. And three of them are mainly we can mention at this point Carole Pateman, Claus Offe, and Philippe van Parijs. We thought that it would be great to invite the three of them to join this panel, and they immediately accepted to come to react and to tell us what they think about this book. Unfortunately, Carole Pateman finally couldn't make it, so Ms. Alma Zeleke is Alma Zeleke. She is not Carole Pateman, but she sent some comments which Alma Zeleke very kindly agreed to read. So I mean, we have proper comments from Carole Pateman. So in some way, she will be here with us. Well, just to finish and to let the relevant person speak, the structure of the session will be as follows. Simon will offer a general overview on the book and maybe pointing to several important issues for us to debate. And then on that order, Carole/Almas will react, then Claus will react as well, and finally Philippe van Parijs will react as well. Simon then will give an answer to his commentators, and then we'll open up the doors to a broader discussion with all of you willing to join us. Okay, so Simon, now it's time for you to tell us things.
Well, thank you so much, David, for this extremely generous introduction. Now I feel that anything I say will be very disappointing. Will be disappointed by things I say. I want to thank David, of course, for taking this initiative, and also, as David indicated, Jürgen de Wispeler.
You are too tall.
And it's a great honor, obviously, to have all of these distinguished professors as my discussants here today. So thanks to all of you for kindly accepting the invitation. So it's difficult to summarize this whole book in 15 or 20 minutes. but I'll address some of the core themes of the work that I thought might be especially interesting to discuss given the composition of this panel. So my project begins from the observation that debates on social justice and basic income have developed and matured considerably over the past few decades, not the least thanks to all the efforts channeled into these BIEN conferences since 1986. So it's guided by the thought that it's time to take stock, to reconsider basic income in light of some of the key contributions of this period. What did we learn, and what should we conclude? So what evolves from this is an interpretive account of central works and disagreements in this debate. So I hope that it can usefully serve as an introduction. But it is also more fundamentally a justification of basic income rooted in a conception of social justice that I refer to as radical liberalism, borrowing a term from Bruce Ackerman. Now, to avoid confusion, I should state right away that radical liberalism, it's not meant to suggest that this book proposes some radical form of laissez-faire or pro-capitalism vision. I'm a bit troubled by the fact that I've received quite a few requests or invitations from various neoliberal think tanks lately. So, I mean, the project is radical in the egalitarian sense, that it aims to address inequalities at their root. It demands us to counteract many inequalities left unaddressed by existing welfare states and the ideals associated with traditional social democracy. At the same time, it is liberal in the sense that its interpretation of the egalitarian ideal and the kind of distributive scheme it defends seeks to respect people's diverse conceptions of the good life. And it does so by seeking to provide genuine access to a greater range of lifestyles than those typically accessible within existing welfare states that tend to be, of course, quite narrowly centered around the world of employment and consumerism. I should also say that this view is developed in close dialogue with ideas and concepts of John Rawls's theory of justice. It's not that I think that everything John Rawls said is the best or wisest thing to say or think about social justice, but I found him and his work to be a fantastic discussion partner. I mean, there are so many useful concepts and ideas in Rawls's work that help us articulate and specify the many rival intuitions about social justice and basic income. And I should also say that I am especially sort of inspired by Rawls's emphasis on the limits of what he referred to as welfare state capitalism, that we need to move beyond the redistribution of welfare state capitalism, and we must address the underlying initial inequalities that structure our relationships in such a society. It's pre-distribution, if you like. I'll get back to that in a second. Now, if you begin with these kinds of normative commitments, liberalism and radicalism, and this interest in pre-distribution, a very natural starting points for spelling out the conception of social justice that could respect these desiderata would be Philippe van Parijs and his conception of justice as real freedom for all. Following in the footsteps of Philippe, I have argued that combining this liberal respect for different conceptions of the good life with an egalitarian commitment to counteract the impact of morally arbitrary circumstances, circumstances of brute luck on our opportunities in life, gives us a very powerful basis for the justification of unconditional cash payments. And I won't go into the details of this particular argument, but I can just mention that according to this general viewpoint, the basic income is a powerful instrument to equalize opportunities associated with the many gifts we are so very unequally positioned to receive, including natural resources, inherited resources, gifts, and the gifts that Philippe thinks are incorporated in the wages in existing labor markets, the so-called employment rents. We receive all these gifts. Some receive very much, others receive very little, depending on a wide range of more or less luck-based circumstances beyond our control. And we could address these inequalities by trying to maximize the share of these resources available to the least advantaged in a form that provides as much flexibility as possible to use them for very different purposes. And this is still a notion of equality of opportunity, because the idea is that we can provide people with equal or maximum shares of these resources, and we can allow them to use them for different purposes and to take responsibility for the outcome of these choices. And Philippe can correct me if I say stranger things here. Now, I think that Van Parijs provides a very powerful way of specifying this liberal notion of equality of opportunity. At the same time, I'd like to stress that my project differs importantly from that of Philippe, and broadly re-libertarian, left libertarian pleas for basic income for a number of reasons. And I'll just mention two sort of deviations from this way of thinking about social justice that might be especially interesting, considering, for instance, David's interest in republicanism and Carole's interest in democratic justifications of basic income. Now, the first thing that I would like to emphasize here is that my view stresses the conditions for agency, for equality of status as a prioritized concern. So the aim of providing people with as much opportunity as possible to act on whatever individual preferences they may have is not necessarily the most urgent thing to do. It's crucial that we also make sure to endow them with the capacity to make valuable and well-informed choices consistent with their own sense of self-worth and with their mutual recognition of each other as equals. And this requires that we ask questions like, what kind of cultural background structure do people access? To which kind of education are they entitled? Do they access the social basis for making their choices with a non-subservient self-conception, and so a lively sense of self-worth? There are, of course, many theories that articulate these kinds of concerns of equality of status. And in my own case, my way of specifying them builds on John Rawls's notion of the social basis of self-respect. And I present an interpretation of that idea which emphasizes the need for a context for social recognition and a solid protection of personal independence as two of the key pillars of a policy to serve this end. So in my view, this requires us to ask if people are stuck with authority structures under which they have no option but to bow and scrape to others in order to satisfy their basic needs. Are people free from conditions of exploitable dependency that prevent them from speaking freely to form independent judgments, whether in their families, in their workplaces, or in political debates, without fear to have the basis of their livelihood withdrawn? And do they access social paths for meaningful activities and gainful recognition in the labor market or elsewhere that can offer a basis of self-esteem? So, one of the reasons why I find the basic income so interesting has to do with its status-conferring potential, both negatively, by giving us the bargaining power to avoid bad things, such as demeaning exposure the demeaning exposure associated with welfare dependency, and the need to strategically anticipate the reactions of those we depend on to what we say or do. But also positively by enabling the emergence of more inclusive and accessible paths for social recognition. Now, I think that if we are exclusively concerned with the freedom to lead very different kinds of lives along broadly left libertarian lines, this will typically include the protection of lives structured by subordination, submissiveness, and fundamental power asymmetries. And it seems to me that if we have this left libertarian way of thinking, and we have this concern for opportunity and the emphasis on responsibility, it seems to me that we have no really fundamental reasons to find a basic income preferable to various forms of basic capital, that is, lump sum payments. Lump sum payments that people can spend freely and then live with the consequences. But if we also hold that any such opportunity, equalizing, responsibility sensitive project must be balanced against the impact of a distributive scheme on equality of status, and therefore the freedom from exploitable dependency and opportunities for gainful participation, I think that the option of continuously countering economic inequality of holdings through unconditional basic income rather than basic capital will seem far more promising. There are, of course, many other ways of defending why we should have basic income rather than basic capital, and I'm aware of the fact that Philippe prefers the basic income option, but I'm inclined to think that the most straightforward and natural way to do so is to address specifically the demands of respect and self-respect. Okay, so broadly speaking, my argument for why inequalities are objectionable and basic income a useful way of doing something about them rests on these two different arguments. The argument from equality of opportunity appeals to the fact that opportunities are massively unequal due to circumstances largely or mainly beyond our control, brute luck. And the argument from equality of status appeals to the fact that our social life is structured by fundamental power asymmetries that prevent us from interacting as equals, that is, under which we live at the mercy of others for the satisfaction of basic needs. So I think we need both of those two components. Because, so this is the first sort of deviation from this broadly left libertarian approach to insist that we need to have this notion of equality of status in place. So I think it's a more sort of pluralistic approach to the egalitarian ideal. The second thing I'd like to emphasize is my project's analytical focus on the role of stability in a sense inspired by Rawls. The capacity of an institutional ideal to generate its own support, to maintain the preconditions for its own reproduction. And related to this are individual duties to promote and maintain a just order. Now, for Philippe, this respect for different conceptions of the good life famously implies that even those preferring to spend their days surfing must be fed. And he suggests, and I have sympathy for the argument, that not doing so would be objectionably illiberal, disrespectful. Suppose we have a set of inherited assets to which nobody has a prior claim. It would seem discriminatory only to provide a share of them to people with an employment-centered conception of the good life. But once we attend to the role of civic virtues and the broader social ethos and the broader norms needed for social justice to last, not just to be realized, but also to remain in place over time. I think we also need to recognize that we do have justified concerns about the forms of behavior and dispositions encouraged by a given distributive scheme. In the Republican tradition, it's emphasized that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. So citizens cannot afford to quietly sit down as spectators or go surfing while leaving to politicians and institutions to give them freedom. And I think this is important, and this makes it clear that not any attempt to sort of shape behavior can be dismissed as objectionably illiberal. Now, I think we need to incorporate these broadly Republican concerns into our justification of basic income, but doing so within the framework of a broadly liberal justification of basic income, it's not a trivial thing. I think it's clear that we do need such an ethos. We do need an infrastructure of participation supportive to the productive and many other needs of a just society. But at the same time, we need a path for specifying the demands of the required ethos and that spirit of contribution that remains consistent with liberal objectives. It seems clear that, I mean, if we say that we need this ethos to help support, maintain justice, and therefore we need people to contribute and participate in these things, it's clear that the basic income will not actually deliver its promise of a society in which people are genuinely free to pursue a much greater diversity of lifestyles, including options beyond the employment contract, if those who make other choices than full-time employment are ostracized, socially excluded as a result of doing so. So having in mind Philippe's surfers here, it's not clear what would be gained for them if we now say that yes, they are entitled to an income, but if it is now impossible to actually pursuing their surfing intensive projects without official condemnation and social exclusion, that is ostracism. So they have their entitlement, but they are ostracized. So that doesn't really work. So I've been struggling with this tension between needs of feasibility, stability, and at the same time these liberal objectives, often articulated in terms of liberal neutrality, respect for diverse conceptions of the good life. So this is one of the things that I explore, also in part in dialogue with Philippe's work, and Philippe at some point mentioned that, well, actually I would prepare to go along with a very strict work ethos on strictly instrumental grounds, because that's helpful to boost the prospects of the least advantage, to maximize the highest sustainable basic income. And to me, this is sort of, it's difficult to, this establishes a very clear tension with a liberal core motivation for why we should have the basic income in the first place, why it would be superior to sort of traditional social democratic forms of conditional income support. So that's an interesting tension, perhaps, between my view and the views expressed in some passages of Philippe. I don't know what's your current view on that. It'd be interesting to hear. Anyway, my own view is that the case for basic income I think it can satisfy both of these demands by accepting the need for an ethos that is not overly demanding and that remains, with Claus Offe's words, non-productivist. In the sense that it's not exclusively tied to the formal labor market. So our practices for realizing and maintaining a demanding ideal of social justice, including a basic income, depend, of course, on a high volume of taxable income. So we need people to work, to do paid work. But it also depends on political activity, the education and care of our children, the maintenance of a rich cultural structure, environmental care, and a wide range of other contributions that are inevitably or preferably informal in nature. So I'm inclined to think that the basic income has great potential to serve and reproduce this type of ethos, and that even liberal supporters of basic income have reasons to wholeheartedly embrace an ethos of contribution and the sense of duty with which it is associated. Okay. So let me just close by illustrating the practical significance of some of these theoretical dividing lines. And I want to sort of warn or distance myself against what I regard as very simplistic approaches to basic income. And what I have in mind primarily here is you know, for instance, the kind of argument you find in Charles Murray's work, In Our Hands. I mean, we could easily afford a substantial basic income by dropping the idea of state-provided, income-related social insurance based on accustomed living standards, and by allowing it to replace the case for universal access to a wide range of social services that are currently heavily subsidized in existing advanced welfare states. I mean, things like high-quality daycare services, parental leave, healthcare services, access to higher education, and things like that. So some will be tempted to say, well, drop all of these expensive things, and then we suddenly have plenty of resources for the financing of the basic income. And wouldn't that be a more liberal thing to do? Then we can respect people's preferences and so on. Now, I think we have reasons for why many of these arrangements are no less important than the basic income to the general cause of social justice. And one aspect of this, the only thing I'll mention here, can be illustrated by considering the impact of replacement-oriented, cash-centered proposals for basic income on the gender structure of our societies, and the worries of some feminists that the basic income may actually help conserve a traditional gender division of labor by leading more women to withdraw partially or wholly from the labor market. Again, some will claim that what matters is to give people the freedom to follow whatever individual preferences they might have, and that this need for flexibility gives a presumption for cash payments. And perhaps purely left libertarian proposals for basic income will tend to respond to potentially gender conservative effects of such a basic income by saying, well, so what? You'll have to respect people's freedom. And the approach that I've sketched differs fundamentally from this type of view by arguing that equality of status matters in its own right. So I think we need to reject the kind of monism according to which all or most injustices are simply reducible to resource inequalities that can be dealt with by way of redistribution in cash. So in assessing social justice, I think we cannot look exclusively at the value of external resources that people control. We must also look at the real opportunities available for gainful participation and the prospects for being recognized and thus identify as equals, not just to be bossed around as subordinates or as servants at home in their everyday lives. And it seems clear to me that in-kind transfers, services, the societal ethos, all of these things, they play an important role for protecting the basis of this status. We also know that the prospects for an ethos supportive to the equal status of women and men are not unrelated to the gender patterns of participation in employment, politics, and the public sphere at large. So I think we do have reasons to be concerned with gender conservative outcomes of some basic income proposals. And I'm not here making any empirical claims about the impact of basic income on the gender structure. This is, of course, highly uncertain and contested and depends very strongly on details of the specific proposals. So the only thing that I want to state here and to emphasize is that this status clearly depends on a complex interaction between transfers, social services, social ethos. So we should try to identify a path in which our response to these demands of equality, equality of opportunity and equality of status, move in tandem. I think that basic income is attractive from that point of view, not then as a replacement of the welfare state, but as a means for simultaneously making it more radical and more liberal. So I think I'll stop there now. Thank you very much.
Almas, now it's time to hear about Carole's reactions. And thanks, Alma, for agreeing to do it.
Yes, I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this discussion of Simon's work and to be channeling no less than Carole Pateman in doing so. I don't think I can do her accent, but I do have her words in front of me, so I will read her words. Simon Birnbaum has given us a very good addition to the political philosophy literature on basic income. It is a well-argued book that looks at some major questions about and objections to basic income and has some interesting things to say. He defends universalism and unconditional support for a secure, if modest, standard of living for everyone. In general terms, I'm in sympathy with his substantive conclusions. Simon calls his approach institutional ideal theory, and it is derived from John Rawls and the literature on liberal egalitarianism. Given that a Rawlsian approach is so popular among political philosophers, I am pleased to see such a good defense of basic income in a Rawlsian framework, although his argument pushes up against its boundaries at a number of points. However, this framework has its limitations, one of which is that it is an exercise in ideal theory. Simon's institutional ideal theory broadens out the Rawlsian framework, which is welcome, but the limitations remain. I now want to discuss three of these limitations and offer a concluding remark. First, Simon states that from an ideal theory perspective, the question is whether the ideal would be viable if it were in place. But that seems to me to put the cart before the horse, before the non-ideal question of how we get from here to there. How does Simon's ideal of basic income get put into place? This is related to another feature of the Rawlsian framework which he discusses, that it assumes a broad compliance with general values and arrangements. But in our contemporary circumstances, we are moving away from compliance with the values and arrangements necessary for basic income in the form that Simon supports. The last 3 or 4 decades have seen the breakdown of and deliberate efforts to destroy whatever consensus might have existed on values and institutions, including those of the welfare state. In his final chapter, Simon discusses the kind of policies required to implement his form of basic income and argues for a robust system of public provision. The last 30 years have seen the rise to power of neoliberal capitalist doctrines, including structural adjustment, also known as austerity. Once reserved for poor countries, this is now being vigorously implemented in Europe, including reduction in the living standards of ordinary people and the reduction or privatization of public services. This development means that values which Simon's argument supports are losing a good deal of ground. Moreover, neoliberals can provide their own version of basic income within the society they are creating. It would be a basic income along the lines advocated by Charles Murray: abolish the welfare state, give individuals some money, and let them sink or swim. Neoliberal doctrines are based on and promote self-interest and not the public spirit or sense of justice that Simon calls for. One does not have to look very far to see the foothold that self-interest has gained in Western societies. Simon presents an argument, to which I am very sympathetic, about the way in which a basic income would help develop public-spirited virtues. Unfortunately, the existing basis for such a development is being rapidly undermined. All in all, the present seems to me to be the time par excellence for non-ideal theory. Second, another limitation of a Rawlsian framework is its focus on justice and moral arguments, which is not to say that justice, morality, and moral arguments are unimportant, rather that there are other ways of arguing for and reaching conclusions similar to those of Simon. Another characteristic of Rawlsian argument is that the wider political context is taken for granted. In particular, it is presupposed that the context is democratic. Simon mentions, on page 74, a, quote, well-organized democracy, but does not elaborate, despite his emphasis on institutions, on what that looks like. What constitutes democracy is a contested political matter, notwithstanding all the official emphasis on democracy as free and fair elections. And those are a great deal more difficult to implement than is usually supposed. Witness current efforts in the US and states with Republican governors to eliminate large numbers of poor and minority voters from the electoral rolls. Democratic theory is a long-standing interest of mine, and I have paid some attention to the question of the institution of employment in democracy, which is one reason that I find basic income so significant. The institution of employment is something else that lies outside Rawlsian analysis. Rawlsians do not examine the undemocratic structure of that institution and how its structure is interconnected to other power structures, gender and racial, for example. When workers enter employment, they do not become equal participants in a productive enterprise, but are told what to do. They become subordinates. This is a long way from the free and equal persons and citizens of Rawlsian ideal theory. The institution of employment, fundamental to neoliberalism, has been spread around the world very rapidly over the last 3 decades, and has a very large place in debates about both the welfare state and basic income. True, many advocates of basic income, like Simon, want to give forms of contribution other than employment proper recognition. He has a good discussion of the peculiarities of an understanding of contribution that sees paid labor as the only contribution that counts, and so welfare is turned into workfare. Yet, for the most part, the undemocratic institution of employment, so central to the life of our society, remains beyond scrutiny in liberal egalitarian literature. And I might add that the power of the idea of employment is now such that it is often forgotten that the institution is a historical and social creation and not the natural way of doing things. Third, I now want to turn to 2 other interrelated questions to which Simon devotes attention in his book: questions of cooperation and reciprocity. Arguments about cooperation derive directly from Rawls and his statements about seeing social life as a fair cooperative scheme. Claims about cooperation require a great deal more unpacking than they receive in the liberal egalitarian and basic income literature. Simon cites the following from Rawls on page 73, quote, "Social cooperation makes possible a better life for all than any would have had if each were to live solely by his own efforts." This statement supposes that there is an alternative to social cooperation, a supposition that ultimately derives from the individualist starting point of the Rawlsian framework. And I might add, personally, the androcentric notions of independence in the Rawlsian framework as well. This statement supposes, but where does this person come from who only lives by his own efforts? Does he, to use Hobbes's phrase, spring up like a mushroom? There are at least 3 levels of cooperation which need disentangling. First, at the most general level, social life is cooperation. No one would survive without the cooperation of others. Indeed, no one would get past infancy, and all the arguments about future generations in the Rawlsian literature would be pointless. Although this fundamental conceptual point has to be emphasized, it does not tell us anything about the other two levels. Second, and there are many and varied forms of social organization, and thus cooperation, that a given society might adopt. And then third is the specific level of the form of social organization in a particular society. In Rawlsian discussions, it is taken for granted that social life is organized so that the institution of employment is fundamental to its operation. It is at this level that all the questions about cooperation, contributions, reciprocity, and benefits arise, and questions about discretionary time and post-productivism discussed by Simon are important. It is a curious feature that despite all the talk of cooperation in this literature, there is little or no discussion of cooperative workplaces. Incidentally, the discussion of contributions has a very long history in feminism. The contemporary arguments cited by Simon are just its most recent iteration, and particularly in arguments about the suffrage and claims about specific contributions made by women that should count as part of citizenship. Let us now turn briefly to reciprocity. In its most general sense, reciprocity and cooperation are closely related, and both are built into the fabric of social life. Reciprocity stretches over time and space. We all rely every day, to a large extent implicitly, on countless acts that look forward to other reciprocal acts that we expect in the future, or are in response to actions that have assisted us in the past. And consider the point I made earlier about infants. Neither mothers nor all those engaged in caring work demand an immediate reciprocal contribution from, for example, young children, the sick, infirm, or elderly in return for benefits. In contrast, the standard discussions around welfare and basic income use a very narrow, contractual, or economistic view of reciprocity in which a specific contribution is owed directly in return for a benefit. Just as the employer benefits from the worker's labor and pays a wage in return, if a citizen receives a basic income, a contribution, primarily in the form of employment, is due in return. But given that one of the major advantages of a basic income, if set at the appropriate level, is that it would allow for freedom from employment, why should supporters of basic income accept this notion of reciprocity and the primacy of the labor market? In social life, outside of markets, few areas of reciprocity operate in this contractual fashion, least of all in ensuring individuals' well-being. Let me note here that the debate in the literature usually overlooks another question. Does what is held to be owed depend on how benefits are distributed? Perhaps poor citizens owe less than the better off. My final comment. In his last chapter, Simon argues that extensive public provision is required along with basic income, a position with which I concur. Public provision is also required to sustain and strengthen democratic citizenship and to uphold a form of individual autonomy that goes beyond the philosopher's minimal autonomy that he discusses. Individual autonomy in the form of participatory self-government requires democratization of major authority structures, including the workplace. And I would argue it requires institutional, non-ideal political theory. Thank you.
Letting me comment on Simon Birnbaum's book, which I have read in the original version as a printed dissertation rather than the book itself. Then I understand there are some changes made to the book, but I don't think that affects the major argument, or at any rate the argument I want to make. It is a book strongly to be recommended for a crystal clear introduction into the political philosophy and related debates on basic income, and who wants to go into these issues in a serious way has no better choice than reading the book and studying it, and also looking at the work that is referenced in the book. So it inspired me to try something on you, which I have never done before, but which may be simplistic in contrast to the book itself, but nevertheless maybe a way to organize our thinking about this. There are two arguments, or two families of arguments for basic income. And the two key terms in the book itself highlight this difference between two approaches. One term is opportunity and the other term is status. Let me, in an economic, I think, metaphor, describe the first approach of providing a qualified defense, as Simon does, for a basic income. Let me describe this as a supply-side arguments. Supply-side arguments for basic income start with, I think you used the term pre-distribution in contrast to redistribution, right? Pre-distribution, that is the distribution of opportunities that that individuals have to face. And these are basically natural and non-natural, that is man-made endowments. These endowments can be internal, and that means talents and everything that you get from your education. And they can be external, and external endowments that make for unequal opportunities include inherited wealth, natural resources, as in the case of Alaska, and Philippe makes the same argument extensively, civilizational accomplishments. We have inherited something from previous generations that we benefit from and that other people do not benefit from, and that is a difference in our endowments. And in order to equalize endowments, something like basic social rights, including, for instance, to education, but also basic income can be introduced. An argument from justice to neutralize the morally arbitrary or morally irrelevant patterns of endowments. That is what in Rawls and Dworkin is called brute luck, right? And you use that term. As we all know, it is scandalously unjust, the patterns of distribution, both within our societies, national societies, and at a global scale. It has been estimated, if I remember the number correctly, that, and I think the quote is from you, Philippe, Herbert Simon has made this calculation, 90% of the variance of lifetime income is explained by one factor. The factor is place of birth. This is scandalous. I mean, it cannot be covered by any prescriptive theory of justice. Why should that be so? And if anything, it's getting worse, right? So this is the supply of the elementary resources, internal as well as external, positive as well as negative, you could say, to make it more complex, which basic income is one way to address. There are other ways, and okay, this is the supply side argument. Equalize opportunity in a serious way so as to neutralize morally arbitrary predistributional patterns. Okay, now briefly, the second argument starts with needs and demands on the part of people, needs that can be covered or responded to by introducing a basic income. There are two subfamilies. One has to do with poverty, inequality, exploitability, as you pointed out, dependency, being the object of others taking unfair advantage of me. This is dependency, and it is a version of dependency that can more broadly defined as the absence of liberty or the absence of freedom. I use this synonymously here. The impossibility to say no. Many authors writing on basic income, including Götz Werner, as I heard, made this liberty argument, the liberty to say no, to reject some form of employment, the key element. And also the liberty, Bob Goodin has made the argument that the decisive, made empirical support for the argument that the decisive dimension of liberty and life satisfaction in societies such as ours is the disposable time, free time or liberated time is what a basic income can provide. And one collective version of that liberty is the liberation basic income can provide for all of us, namely liberation from the need to be employed, to sell our labor power, and to obey the dictates of the market. Let me conclude with a third set of remarks, and that is inspired by and related to a previous panel on degrowth. I think it would liberate, the basic income has a potential of liberating us from the need to grow, at least in certain parts of the world, taking care of the objection that Philippe made. One can act as if we were in a choice situation, and that would not be right. The previous panel I'm referring to, many of you were present, was framed as if there is a choice. Do we want more growth, or do we want less growth, or what quality of growth, and where do we want it? As far as advanced capitalist societies are concerned, this question is already answered. There is no growth. We are in a de facto situation of stagnation, and all growth that takes place is credit financed, debt financed, and thus non-sustainable. Moreover, the only reason why we depend upon growth, namely to create employment, is also not implemented, because in Germany, for instance, you have presently more people in gainful activity of any kind than was the case ever before. But the numbers of hours they work is smaller than it was ever before. So much of employment, by its very statistical definition, being gainfully active for more than 3 hours per week is fictional. A final remark. We have many systems of our welfare states under rapid change and great pressure. Many systems that move from work-related modes of financing benefits to tax citizen-related modes of financing benefits. The poor, the unemployed, the asylum seekers, the precariously employed, parents, children, the elderly, students, veterans, the handicapped, farmers, health workers, small and medium enterprises, they all depend upon fiscally provided subsidies and top-ups of welfare state benefits. So we are in the move, and that explains part of the public debt, in the move from work-related to citizen-related benefit system, strongly graduated. And the question suggested by this observation is, wouldn't it be then a good idea to integrate all these highly targeted systems and create one system which is called unconditional basic income? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also, Simon, for what I think is really a beautiful exemplar of the sort of political philosophy which I try myself to practice and which I want to encourage. Also, Simon mentions in his preface that it's unlikely that this work would have been existed had he not met members of the BIEN community at the Barcelona Congress 8 years ago. And so I think it's really a wonderful fruit of the philosophical dimension of our encounters of the basic income movement. Had the basic income movement and BIEN not produced anything apart from a book like this one, I think it would still have been worth doing. So congratulations on the achievement. Now, my comments are somehow improvised because it was not initially planned that I should take part in this workshop. And then, given that there was a gap due to Carole not being there, I was asked to join. So let me then simply say something about the relationship between you, what you are doing in your work, and roles. So Carole, in her comments, reproaches you of being too Rawlsian, so adopting an ideal theory, sort of conception of what a just society should be, and indeed you are more Rawlsian than I am, and you may be right, and I'll explain why in two ways I've been sort of evolving since publication of my Real Freedom for All book in the two directions you mentioned in your presentation now. So, well, the story about the relationship between roles and basic income didn't start too well, right? And Simon is in the process of making it end well, right? It didn't start too well for the following reason. So the idea of basic income came to me in 1982. By 1985, I became convinced that the main objections, the main obstacle to basic income was not of a technical nature, of a financial nature, of an economic nature. It was of an ethical nature, because you had all these people, left and right, saying, well, it is possible, of course, but it would be awful to have it. It would be giving money to people who do nothing. So therefore, it will never be politically feasible because it's simply morally despicable, right? So I thought, if we want to get it through, we need to do something about it. And then, by that time, I had read and studied Rawls and started propagating contemporary American political philosophy on the continent. I thought, there I have the justification. Rawls himself, in some piece before A Theory of Justice, and in Theory of Justice, mentions negative income tax as a way of implementing his famous difference principle, one of his two principles of just distribution. And in 1987, there was a big conference in Paris on the occasion of the publication of the French translation of Rawls' theory of justice. So I had prepared my presentation as one of the few, I think one of the two continental people at the time who studied Rawls. I was invited to give a talk, and my talk was essentially a sort of Rawlsian justification of basic income. But even before giving the talk, I was staying in the same hotel as Rawls, and he and I were the only ones to get up early. So I had the great privilege of having twice a very long breakfast conversation with Rawls. And of course, I felt like a little graduate student meeting sort of very venerable moral and political philosopher. So I had my 700 questions to ask him. And so, of course, one of the questions was, what about basic income? Is it not obvious that it follows from your theory? And he said, no, Philippe, think about these surfers spending their whole day surfing off Malibu. He said that it was about 7:15 in the morning at the Hôtel des Grands Hommes next to the Panthéon. And I'll always remember, surely justice requires that they should look after themselves and sort of just provide. It would not be right for the general public to provide for their existence. And so I thought, well, obviously the whole of my argument to be presented that day at the conference collapsed, seemed to be shaky, and I felt I had to do more work. So when I was invited, 4 years later, 91, Sen and Rawls invited me to Harvard to give a conference, which I started with this quote from Rawls, and then it was later published under the title Why Surfers Should Be Fed. And given that Rawls, who was present, made an objection, but didn't seem to be that strong then. So I developed it, and that became the book. But, you know, with Rawls, you have to be careful, because Rawls, I often think, is like God for Pascal. There's in the Pensée de Pascal, there is a sentence that says, un peu de pensée éloigne de Dieu, beaucoup y ramène. A little bit of thinking takes you away from God, but a lot of thinking takes you back to Him. And Rawls is a bit the same, and so Simon is inviting us back to Rawls, along these two dimensions related to what he said. First one is statures, related to Rawls's notion of the social basis of self-respect, or what I've also sort of been forced to introduce under the heading or the label of parity of esteem or equal dignity. And in fact, in my most recent book published last year about linguistic justice, called Linguistic Justice in Europe and in the World, I end up with final proposal. The bottom line, if you want, is a strong defense of convergence towards a common lingua franca in Europe and in the world. And I realize this doesn't prompt immediate unanimity. I had a pretty heated discussion just at lunchtime now with some of the French participants in this room, in this conference. But this combined with a sort of strong defense of the diversity of languages in the world, and through what I call the coercive linguistic, territorially structured coercive linguistic regime. There is a right for linguistic communities to defend their languages within a particular territory in various ways. I won't go into that. But in fact, the justification for, I think that's just, but this cannot be justified within the framework of real freedom for all, of an opportunity egalitarian conception of justice. And the moral basis for that, the normative justification, is some conception of justice as what I call equal dignity or parity of esteem, or could also be phrased by referring to the social basis of self-respect or this equality of status. I won't make here the connection with the linguistic issue, but that means that I was forced to sort of go back to Rawls more than get closer to him than I was in Real Freedom for All by making room for this dimension. And then, but the problem that arises, and that would also arise in your framework, Simon, is that when you have these two considerations that enter your conception of justice, there can be trade-offs. That is, what is best in terms of giving the greatest real freedom through the people with least real freedom may not be best, or may conflict with what is required by equality of statures. And so I could specify that a bit more in the light of what you said, but I rather, not to take too much time, I'll mention the second issue, which is related to what you said about the ethos. And so the bottom line of my Real Freedom book was that what justice requires, whatever the immediate best measures may be, gradual and so on, but as a long-term objective is the highest sustainable basic income, ecologically, economically sustainable, on the scale on the larger scale that is politically feasible. The highest sustainable basic income. Okay, but this means that, well, it's not bad to grow, to have an economy that grows. It's not bad also if people supply a lot of labor. Hence, and I admit that also at the end of Real Freedom for All. So I said, well, you introduce an unconditional basic income, but of course the highest feasible level, the highest sustainable level of basic income will be higher if people love to work, if they find it important for their self-respect, for their prestige, or because they like intrinsically to perform paid labor. So the more importance people attach to that, the less sensitive they will be to higher taxation, to fund the basic income. Tax them at 50% on each euro they earn. They'll keep working the way they did before. Tax them at 70%, the same. They don't do it for the money anyway because they love work. So the stronger the work ethos in the society, the better it is for basic income. Similarly, I had no problem, and I said that explicitly at the end of the book, to develop a patriotic ethos at all levels, even at the level of your firm, so that you are attached to your firm, and it's not because another firm would pay better or even less. It's not because your country would tax you more that you would want to move to another country. So patriotism defined in this way is good for a basic income. Because it weakens the tax competition between various countries, or at least as long as we don't have a tax system at a high level. So so what I'm led to, so leave aside the patriotism thing, is that, well, if the ultimate criterion of a just society is the highest sustainable basic income, then you should spread a work ethos, and you should therefore favor growth, unending growth. And then I had, that's where the challenge comes, and where Rawls, like God, may be right in the end, but like God, according to Pascal, it's the following. So, and that arose in connection then with an exchange I had with Rawls at a much later stage, shortly before he died. So a couple of years before, so we had a discussion on the manuscript of his Law of Peoples. And I strongly disagree. If there is one thing I really disagree with Rawls, it's still his conception of global justice. But he may be right in the end. But and then we had this discussion about the European Union, and that was, with his permission, it was then published, and the only couple of paragraphs were the only text in which he speaks about the European Union, and where he's strong, he says, he sort of recommends, he begs the Europeans not to go the American way. They say, please keep you distinct countries, each with their traditions. Don't try to make United States of Europe that would be awash in consumerism and subservient to the capitalist banks. So it's also his most anti-capitalist text. Although he allowed me to publish it, it was not meant initially for publication. That may be the reason why he was nearly as radical as Simon is radical. Anyway, so but that passage it ends by saying that what he goes for is certainly not the growth, including for the sake of the maximum level of socio-economic advantages of the worst off. But he says, my own ideal, and then he has this quotation, this reference to John Stuart Mill's famous passage about the stationary state, and where he says what we need is to get to a position in which growth will no longer be justified. And this jars, of course, with my more simple-minded view that what the requirement of justice could be summed up, could be encapsulated in a simple principle of maximum sustainable basic income, possibly with some of the basic income given in kind and in the form of services and all the things that have been said, but nevertheless the maximum sustainable with some notion of real income that should be consistent across generations and across countries, which is far from tricky. We just talked about that with Claus earlier today. And so, but nevertheless, it's in a context of continuing growth. And he says, no, that's not what a just society would be. And a just society would be, well, all the society should be consistent with a stationary state, a zero rate of growth, of per capita growth of the population. Here it is.
Okay, I don't know whether Pascal said something about how to make the impossible, but I think we have to make the impossible, which is using some minutes and maybe some extra minutes to give Simon the opportunity to answer to these questions or to these remarks, or to react, and then try to open up the door to debate with everybody here. So let's try to make it. We don't have much time.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this very generous and rich set of remarks and comments. Yeah, I'll be selective, and there is much to digest here, many comments. But I'll begin with some of Carole's reactions. As she says, I mean, I think we have very similar substantive views about what to do, but we have different paths for arriving at these conclusions. She thinks, I mean, she emphasizes in her comment that we should give priority to non-ideal theory. She also thinks we should give priority to democratic arguments for basic income, and that we should reject these economistic, employment-centered accounts of cooperation. And I mean, as for the last point, I think I agree with her. I have a quite a detailed analysis of Rawls's concept of cooperation and various ways to interpret that, and I also criticize some interpretations of that view and some attempts to reject basic income from within this Rawlsian notion of society as a fair scheme of social cooperation. So I won't say anything more about that here, because I think we agree about that. But I want to emphasize, though, that I mean, I'm not really sure how to interpret them. I mean, she's not here to react, so it's a bit unfair now, Carole. But I don't think that she actually criticizes this enterprise of institutional ideal theory. I'm not sure. But to me, it's clear that we need to devote plenty of efforts to improve our understanding of how to get from here to there. Yes, of course. But that question clearly presupposes that we know something about the direction of this non-ideal project, where we should be heading. So I think it's, I mean, non-ideal theory clearly needs to be guided by some kind of ideal theory and careful attempts to specify the direction and aims that we should seek to realize. So I mean, it's true that I focus on this ideal theory project, and I do so without apologizing. I do it proudly. I think it's an important part of this division of labor. I think these projects, they presuppose one another. You know, every project is always the case that you need limitations in order to have a manageable and focused task and I mean, this is involved, in my case, bracketing a lot of questions, including the role of democracy, which is, of course, something very important. And I mean, I agree with Carole that there are many powerful democratic arguments for basic income. What I do not accept, and I'm not sure if she would accept, that these kinds of arguments would somehow make arguments about social justice redundant, that they would somehow replace social justice-based justifications of basic income. So for me, these projects tend to respond to different questions. One concerns how decisions should be made and by whom in order to be legitimate, and justice has more to do perhaps with which decisions we ought to make and sort of the content of our policies rather than the forms of decision making. So I'm a bit wary about some of the things she said towards the end, and the remarks that seek to establish a very close connection between individual autonomy and collective self-government, participatory self-government. And I mean, to subject a wider set of issues to collective forms of decision-making, that might be a very good thing, but it's not the same thing as social justice or individual freedom, as I see it. So, I mean, obviously, in principle, democracy can be highly participatory, but at the same time, very unjust, which is easily exemplified by populist forms of rule that fail to respect fundamental liberties. So I think we need a way of thinking about social justice and democracy and the relation between these values that enables us to say that. So those are a few reactions, and I will actually be able to meet with Carole in a few weeks, because she was recently awarded with this very prestigious Johan Skytte Award, which is one of the finest awards that a political scientist can receive. So she will come to Uppsala to be celebrated. Yeah. Oh, you're right. Sorry, forget about the time. Yeah. If we are, I mean, turning to non-ideal theory, I think we are provided here with very plenty of food for thought here in some of the reactions from Claus and Philippe. I mean, how do we get from here to there? And what we have this suggestion that we should try to integrate existing targeted systems into one unconditional basic income, and I'm very much in favor of that. And I think Philippe said very interesting things about the euro dividend yesterday. I'd be prepared to vote for that. Claus has also, in his comments, but also in many of his writings that I've been inspired by, emphasized this connection between sort of non-productivist objectives and basic income. I think I mean, basic income has potentially a very important role to play here when it comes to making our economies less growth addicted, let's say. I mean, it's very difficult to resist growth if I mean, we are economically, psychologically, existentially dependent on jobs that in turn depends on this growth. How can we resist? So the basic income, I think, is a very useful way of uncoupling these and getting rid of this growth addiction. So Claus Offe's work on non-productivism has been very inspiring and important. Well, I could go on for a long time if I should just try to say something about Philippe's reactions. You are right, of course, that if we have these two concerns, equality of opportunity and equality of status or parity of esteem, or this will introduce trade-offs. It will be a slightly messier kind of conception of justice, and I think that we simply have to bite that bullet. I mean, we have that kind of complexity, and I think our thinking about justice has to trace that complexity, respond to that complexity. I think it's unavoidable. And what else? I understand, of course, Philippe's reasons for his commitment to the strong work ethos, and I also think that a kind of egalitarian ethos has a very important role to play, also as part of the project that Carole is looking for here, a broad non-ideal, institutional non-ideal theory. I mean, how do we get from here to there? I also think that we depend on, we should, I mean, it's this huge problem with these kinds of very opportunistic reactions to high levels of taxation. We want people to work for not solely for monetary incentives, but also we want people to work because they find work desirable, and we don't want this greed to sort of be the main driving force. And as long as we have that kind of situation, that economic incentives are extremely important for generating a given volume of workload, yeah, that will make a basic income and a more egalitarian project less sustainable, less feasible. But I'll have to think more about these things in order to specify sort of that. So, yeah. But thanks again for all of these comments.
I'm sure there are other people in the room willing to. Yes. Or if you want to comment.
Thank you. Well, I didn't know you personally, but now I am willing to read your book. I would like to ask you a question. If John Rawls were alive, if he, after reading your book, would reconsider his opinion and would now be in favor of the basic income, after the dialogue, the several dialogues that Philippe van Parijs told us. And I would like to enrich what he told by one thing. You know all that when John Rawls, perhaps not everyone here knows, but when John Rawls died, the Harvard University invited Philippe van Parijs to teach philosophy. And since Amartya Sen was a very good friend and admirer of Philippe van Parijs, he invited Philippe van Parijs to teach 2 courses for the graduate students of Harvard. One was justice and cultural diversity, and the next year justice and institutions. And this was in 2005 and 2006. And I was very lucky to be invited because I was nearby. And I asked them, may I attend the first lecture of the first and the third lecture of the second course, and I was there. And let me just tell you, because this is the continuation of their conversation, because Amartya Sen told the students, in this course we will see to what extent different institutions will raise the level of justice in society. When slavery was abolished, of course, we had a higher degree of justice in society. If we provide good educational opportunities to all boys and girls, we will have a higher level of justice. And in this course, we will examine to what extent a basic income, as argued by Philippe Van Parijs and Senator Suplicy, who is visiting us today, will take us to a higher level of society. I became very happy because the Nobel Prize economist Amartya Sen was considering very seriously and more, because you know all that in the book that was published last year in a homage to Philippe Van Parijs, Amartya Sen gave the presentation. It's there in the book, arguing about justice. And so we are already gaining a very important step, because more and more someone like Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize economist, is almost already in favor of the basic income. Otherwise he wouldn't said such very beautiful words about Philippe Van Parijs in his book. And my question is, Simon Bismarck, if we're alive, John Rawls, would you believe that he would be already in favor of Amartya Sen's and Claus Offe and all of us arguments in favor of the best basic income, the most sustainable basic income for all? I believe that, well, it's my guess that after reading a rousing book, he will be in favor, but I would like to know your answer. Thank you.
Do you want to react fastly, or we group some questions so that, yeah? Somebody else? Yeah. John.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to ask Simon something about his book and about this exchange. It's really about two of the questions that Carole Pateman raised. I'm just interested in your reaction to them. I mean, the one is the question about employment and whether you think that it's a valid criticism that a lot of us in the basic income community, so to speak, have been insufficiently critical of employment itself as a form of participation in the economy, and that we really should start thinking more seriously about replacing the employment as a paradigm of participation by the idea of some kind of more collectivist, cooperative form of economic endeavor, and whether maybe that's something that does need further thinking, or whether you think that that's an unfair criticism. And the other thing that she is reported as having raised was the question of reciprocity, and the idea that maybe a lot of these arguments that you're struggling with, and that others of us have also struggled with, would be eased if we took a broader sense of reciprocity over the course of a lifetime and said, well, okay, we don't have to be thinking about, right here, right now, you're entitled to the basic income, therefore you have to give up the very thing that basic income allows you to do, which is to withdraw from the labor force. It's just that over the course of your life, if you do spend 10 years being a surfer, you should spend some of the rest of the time of your life doing something that is beneficial to other people. But you're not required every minute of your life, or throughout your life, always to be dominated by this idea that, am I doing something that is maximally contributory? So those are the two questions that she raised that I'd be interested in your response to.
Who else? No? So maybe if you can then answer these two questions, and then we see whether we have more.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, as for Rawls, I never met him and I didn't know him personally. Philippe did. Perhaps he is in a better position to speculate about these things. I hope he would accept the argument, but I'm not sure. As for John's questions, well, I agree with Carole's view that in general we should be more concerned about the institution of employment and, the particular forms of employment that dominate our societies, and the prospects within existing forms of employment for, gainful, meaningful forms of participation that gives people a sense of recognition and self-esteem. Of course, there are very many forms of employment that do not provide the necessary conditions for the development of these very important things. So, but is employment itself problematic? Do we need to move beyond employment? I'm not sure. I do certainly think that we need a broader concept of contribution. We need more inclusive paths, more accessible paths to social participation. And I think the basic income is a very important and promising instrument for achieving these things, and also, of course, potentially linked to some of the things that Carole mentioned, workplace democracy and these. But I have no more sort of specific reaction right now at the moment. And of course, it's quite possible to develop nuanced, rich interpretations of reciprocity and its demands, and there are several theories of justice that attempt to move beyond this very simplistic notion that Carole refers to, that we need to have this more generalized notion of reciprocity, and it's something that is going on over the entire lifetime, and perhaps it's even meaningful to speak about intergenerational reciprocity and so on. And Stuart White has had very interesting things to say about that. Now I try to address some of these themes and give some reasons for why we should not ascribe a very fundamental importance to reciprocity in our conceptions of social justice. But I feel I cannot really give you an adequate response or give you the full picture right immediately. But I do try to address some of these concerns, particularly perhaps in chapter 3 of the book. Okay, thank you.
I think Almas has something else to say.
Yes, I have a question.
As Almas, right?
As Almas, yes, not as Carole. Simon, I wanted to pick up on the tension that you identified between the goal and the effect of an unconditional basic income in maximizing freedom, in allowing people to make choices about how they live, what they do, and the effects on gender relations and the gender division of labor. And in particular, I have two questions. One is refers to your discussion of public provision as a necessary co-component with basic income in achieving the kind of society you envision, kind of free society you envision. And this is certainly one of the issues that comes up very often in conversations about gender skepticism about basic income, that in fact a basic income would keep or would push women to back into the domestic sphere, to take care of family, to do the care their work, and one way of pushing against this is public provision of daycare and elder care and so on. And so I'm interested in your take on this tension, because clearly the impulse towards freedom ought to be to allow people to choose, and your concern with status is of course important, but one road to equal status is to allow people to make their own choices, to provide that autonomy on an ongoing basis. And the second aspect that I'd like you to address, if possible, is just the concern about how public provision in diverse societies can be achieved. How do we create institutions of public provision of things like childcare in societies that are also have the desire to be very tolerant of, say, religious differences and religious freedom? This is something that comes up in public school systems in the United States quite frequently, for example.
Thank you very much. Well, obviously, all of these questions must be addressed in a way that's very contextually sensitive. I mean, it would be foolish to provide some universal blueprint. And I mean, looking at the gender distribution of labor and its impact on status, you can't do this in a universal, with a universal point of view. But I do think that, I mean, I share this concern. I think it's very important that people should be provided with resources necessary to make choices in very many directions. But I also think that we must be concerned with these sort of structural patterns that tend to emerge from these individual choices. So we need to keep both of these commitments in mind at the same time. What I'm emphasizing, among other things, is that I really don't think that the basic income is a replacement for I mean, things like high-quality daycare and all these complex things, and many of the in-kind transfers that are also very important component for providing people, and perhaps primarily women, opportunities for participation. I mean, if you just give people an income in a very sort of gender-structured society, many people might use them to sort of, okay, then the woman stays at home, and I mean, you're never even given a chance to participate in other spheres of society. So that's what I'm trying to imply with this rejection of this monism. I mean, I'm not the only one thinking along these lines, but I think that we need a more sort of pluralistic understanding of the egalitarian ideal here. I mean, one thing you mentioned, I can see perhaps you think that, okay, let's have a basic income, because then we could have a way, I mean, a kind of safety net that will allow people with very different cultural commitments and backgrounds to make their different choices. And there's certainly something to that, I think, but we can't be blind to the fact that, and I know you are certainly not blind to the fact that these choices are highly gendered, I mean, in current societies, but I think we have to go into sort of more concrete discussions about specific proposals in specific contexts to perhaps move further. Okay.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Or in fact, we are out of schedule, so maybe it's the moment to thank the participants for having joined the panel, and for showing us that sometimes it seems that we have reached some sort of end of the history of the ideas justifying basic income, and you have showed us that this is not the case and that the show is going on. And so I think we should be very grateful to all of you to have done so. So thank you very much.